tonight, and I would just feel that it will be interesting to everybody over here, and hopefully you will learn something about both Christianity and Islam. Mr. Gary Miller will be presenting this lecture tonight. Mr. Gary Miller was a former Christian who converted to Islam. He's a mathematician, and also he worked in the field of broadcasting as a reporter, and now he's an extensive traveler who travels all over the world presenting lectures about Islam and Christianity. The topic which he's going to be introducing tonight is Christianity and Islam. And at the end of the lecture, we'll open the floor for discussion, and everybody is welcome to ask his question.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I expect maybe that with that very general heading as a title, that you may have in mind to hear any number of things. You may be surprised. Maybe I won't talk about what you expect. Maybe I will talk exactly about the things you expect. But of course, one could fill hours with a title that general. So I just picked on a few things to highlight. I could start off, I suppose, by maybe surprising people in trying to explain something about Islam. What I usually find comes as the biggest surprise to a lot of people. I surprised somebody last night when he said to me, how do Muslims get saved? And I said, they don't even want to be. It came as a surprise, I suppose, because of what is a natural tendency on the part of one large group of people to divide the world into two groups, the saved and the lost. And that division is not found in Islam. That's not how people get divided up, the saved and the lost. That saved is not an exact counterpart to lost. I could go into that and explain, well, how does the Muslim view it? But what I'm trying to illustrate here is what is really a difficulty that is often skipped over. People don't even notice it. Simply this, that an explanation is not the same thing as a proof. See, what too often happens is people are asked, why do you believe such and such is so? And the answer that comes back is an explanation of what they believe to be so. Not why it's true, it's how it works. And an explanation is not a proof. For a long time, through the Middle Ages, people explained fire by saying combustible substances contain phlogiston, and phlogiston under certain conditions turns to flame, and so on. It was an explanation for what people saw. So happens phlogiston doesn't exist, but it did the job of explaining flame for a long time. And yet, I'm sure in the minds of a lot of people, as they explained phlogiston, they thought they were proving something. They were really just accounting for what they had seen. And in a similar way, if a person asks any number of religious questions to say, why do you believe that such and such is the case? What comes back is an explanation of how it's supposed to work. God is holy, man is sinful, there's a gap in between, you fill it like this, you solve this problem this way, and so on. That's an explanation of the story, not why the story is true. The truth is not in the telling of a nice story. At most, what you do when you explain how something works is you show it's plausible. It might be true, but plausibility is still a step away from certainty, having established something. So what I don't want to do is go into a lot of explanation unless you're simply interested in hearing an explanation. Because I'm not going to fool myself or try to fool you into telling you that if I can explain it very well, it must be true. In fact, it's what the scientific community recognizes and jokes about. In the particular field that I'm interested in, more or less as a hobby. Now, I don't have much time because I'm not much of a physical scientist, but I'm interested in the pursuit of unified field theories, and particularly supersymmetry. And the people who follow this rapidly developing field joke among themselves and say, it's so beautiful it must be true. But they know they're telling a joke. It doesn't matter how nice it sounds, how elegant the description is, that still doesn't make it true. Makes it plausible, makes it likely even to be true, if it is neater than a competing theory, but you haven't established it yet. There's something similar to this that can go on, just as saved versus lost forces a choice in the minds of a lot of people. That is, if all they've ever thought about is, well, it's either this or that, they've never considered that maybe there's an alternate way of viewing the whole situation. There is a tendency also to put people in artificial opposition to one's own position. And this is what Muslim frequently hears, in that you have a large group of people who say, man is saved not by works but by faith. Since Muslims disagree with me, well, Muslims must think that man is saved by works and not by faith. It becomes an automatic chain of thought that they follow, and so they often tell them. So people tell me. So you believe that your works save you, not your faith. Tell them, no, I don't believe that. Yes, you do. You must. Because you don't agree with me, you must believe what they have decided is the opposite of what they believe. That, too, is a natural enough tendency, but it's a thing to watch out for, that if you hold a certain position, be careful in trying to decide what exactly is the opposite of the position. Perhaps it has no exact opposite. It has many alternatives. If you tend to think it has an exact opposite, so that's the only option, then you bestow on everybody else this other position, and then proceed to try to demolish that position. You're attacking a man of straw. That is, you're challenging a position that nobody necessarily holds, because you've given him his option. There's something I can cite as another example, which is often misunderstood. I touched on it last night. That is, just quickly mention it and tell you more elaborately the whole story. Was in Pennsylvania last year, when a student group on campus had invited, well, actually they were approached by a Christian group on campus who said, we want to discuss Islam, you bring a Muslim speaker, we'll have a Christian speaker. And the funny thing that happened was, just a few days before this meeting was to take place, the group on campus asked the Muslims, who is your speaker going to be? And they told them my name. These people didn't know me from anybody, name didn't mean anything to them, but their reaction was interesting. They said, that's not fair. Brother, want to know what's not fair? I said, no, we want a Muslim. I said, well, he is, represent us. I said, no. What finally came out is what they wanted was a foreigner. They wanted somebody who was going to trip and stumble through the English language so they could make them look silly, is really what they had in mind. And they worried that it might have some bad effect if somebody who comes from this continent seems to be representing the Muslim position. And at the last minute, they changed their mind about a speaker, and they brought a man from Egypt to talk. So we had an Egyptian Christian talking about Christianity and North American Muslim. He, as it happens, made a lot of the mistakes, I suppose, or gave the impression they were hoping the Muslim would make. But the important thing was, the real lesson of the evening, I guess, is that the speaking was set up so that I spoke, then he spoke, then I spoke, then he spoke. And when I spoke, I said that people don't always hear what a person is trying to say because they're so sure of what you intend to say. So they don't even hear it if you say something different. I stood there, there's the record on videotape, and I said, probably this man will tell you that no Muslim will admit that he's a sinner. So I'm admitting it now. I have sinned, I expect I will again. I have a tendency to do bad things. He's sitting 12 feet away. When it's his turn to speak, he stands there and he says, no Muslim will ever admit that he's a sinner. came my turn to speak again. I said, as I told you, man cannot hear what I'm saying because he wants to put in my mouth a certain position. So I'll tell you again, I am a sinner. Came his turn to speak again, and he said, we can sum up by saying that the whole problem is no Muslim will ever admit that he sins. What is the problem? That he's 12 feet away and he can't hear what I'm saying. It's because of his artificial opposition, saying, since I think this way, he must think that way, in spite of what he says. The point being, I suppose, or the origin of this point, confusion, is probably that the Muslim will say that he rejects the idea of original sin, but what people hear is he rejects the idea that he has a tendency to do wrong. And that's not the point. What the Muslim is denying is that his tendency to do wrong is something that he inherited, that is, he already came with guilt. The denial of inherited sin seems, to the outsider, to be a denial or to be a claim of human perfection. The Muslim is only saying that guilt has to be earned, it can't be bestowed. You can't take someone who has performed no action and judge him guilty already. He hasn't done anything. He's not denying that man tends to do wrong. Now there are other obstacles to understanding that I want to highlight as well. Another one is, use this as a hard and fast rule anywhere, as a caution in any circumstances. If somebody starts to tell you that such and such is the case, and you're protesting that it doesn't seem that it could be so, and you've got objections, beware. When somebody says, oh look, it's like this, and he starts to give you an analogy of what it is he was explaining before. Because now he has two problems. He has to convince you of this analogy that he's drawing, and then he has to show you that this is really like this thing. So analogies can be valuable, but what makes something an analogy is the very fact that at some point it breaks down. This thing is another story from that thing because there is at least some item which makes them two different things. So every analogy at some point breaks down. Otherwise, you're only talking about one thing. The problem often is that the analogy breaks down before the final solution that was supposed to solve the whole problem is given. As an example, it has been said, I suppose it's been around for many years, in trying to justify a particular idea about God, which the Muslim would protest. A man may say, well, look, we have simple animals, and then we have more complex animals, and we have the most complex of all, we have man. Isn't it reasonable to assume that this complexity continues until we have the most complex individual, and that is God? So complex that somehow he manifests himself in three centers of consciousness. That's an analogy. It breaks down too soon is the problem. We already have animals that manifest themselves in many different centers of consciousness. We call them animal colonies, jellyfish and sponges. Is that what he wants to say? God is like a jellyfish? There's a lot of little gods that are all grouped together, or what does he mean? As I say, you have to see, does the analogy do the job, or does it break too soon, and in fact undo the effort? 300 years ago, round and round on Trinity, it's maybe a tired subject to some, but more than 300 years ago, when the Unitarians caused such a stir in England on that subject, it became the subject every Sunday in church. That is, the Church of England. Every Sunday, somebody was telling you the Trinity is like this, or it's like that. It's like an egg, it's like a clover, it's like this, it's like that. Until the word came from the top to stop. They were making it worse. There is no analogy. There's nothing. I promise you. There's nothing you'll ever point to and say, that's like the Trinity. You cannot point to something that is in three parts, but each part is also the whole thing, and yet the parts are distinct. There's nothing. It always has to break down somewhere. Imagine for a moment if it was Muslims who had a Trinity, if the doctrines were reversed. How generous would people be with the Muslim? Would they be saying, would they themselves be hesitating to point out the difficulties with it? I doubt it. Probably a lot of people wish it was that way. It was Muslims who had to defend this idea. But again, a false analogy is sometimes brought up. Sometimes people will say, oh, Muslims have just as much difficulty. Watch carefully where the analogy breaks down. As one speaker had said, I believe in this city some months ago, he said, if the Christian cannot explain how three can still be one, Muslims have a similar problem. They even give the name in Arabic, La bil kaifa, which means without how, because without saying how. The analogy the man tries to draw is to say that, for example, the Quran says God has a hand, and the Muslim will say, well, since God is not something like a man, it's hard to imagine, how could he have a hand? Like a man has a hand, La bil kaifa, I won't say how, and he stops. Well, the problem with that analogy is the Muslim can give several ways how. La bil kaifa means he will not insist on one of them because he doesn't know which is correct or if he's thought of the correct one. He chooses not to say, this is how God has a hand, because he might be mistaken. But he can give 10 different ways that it's possible for God to have a hand. The words may be figurative. It may run parallel to what it says in this verse, and so on and so on. He can give many explanations of how it's possible. He just will not insist that his is the correct one, because he hasn't found an explanation or confirmation of that someplace to say, yes, this is how. It is not a problem of being unable to see how. So the two cases are not parallel. He's not in the position of saying, God has a hand? Impossible! No. I think in many ways that sentence could be accurate. So it's not parallel to someone who says, God is three and yet one. Makes absolutely no sense. I can't imagine how. The two cases don't have any similarity. Another example that I mentioned last night that I know when time is short, maybe it slips by when it's mentioned too quickly. There are many statements which are at least things that you might say could be the case, but after all, they can't be the case because they are impossible. Not difficult, impossible. If I say this man cannot pick up an automobile, what I really mean is it's difficult, but it's not totally out of the question. Under certain circumstances, he might actually turn over an automobile with his bare hands. Very difficult, maybe unlikely, but not impossible. But some things are impossible, not just difficult, impossible, because they deny themselves. That is, if they are true, then they are false. What implies false is false. As an example, I was saying, immortal might become immortal. That makes sense. But if you say this one is immortal, but he became mortal, well, then he wasn't immortal in the first place. Immortal means that describes the condition of someone who cannot be made to die, who cannot be mortal. He's immortal. You can't change it. If he changed from immortal to mortal, well, he wasn't immortal to start with. It was possible for him to be made into something which could be killed, or however you want to define mortality. If someone would insist, well, you can apply both words to one individual, be my guest. If you can put a meaning on that in your mind, to say, this one here, he's mortal, and he's immortal. But you're describing the same individual with two opposite words, go ahead. But then don't be aggravated with me. You have no cause to be aggravated with me if you want to insist that a certain thing is true. That is, you should be just as willing then to allow both your claim and my denial of your claim. Well, you can both be true. I say I'm right, he says I'm wrong, we're both right. It makes as much sense to have two opposite things and say they're both true. And it comes back maybe to near where we started, that we don't want to fool ourselves with how nice the story sounds, because the nice sounding story still doesn't make it true. Sometimes, even if we look more carefully at the sound of the story, maybe it doesn't even sound so nice anymore anyway. As was explained to me one time by a man who'd been a missionary to Yemen for 17 years. Back there now, I understand. He said, God is 100% holy, and man is less than that, so God cannot bear to deal with man directly. Well, an interesting idea. It's a story, it makes a certain kind of sense. Bring it down into daily life. If I tell you back in Toronto where I live is the holiest man that ever lived, suppose I convince you of that. Man is so holy, he just radiates holiness. You tell me I want to come and visit him. And then I'll tell you, no, you can't see him. He couldn't bear to be near you. He's too holy. You can talk to his secretary, maybe. You'd make him ill if you were close to him. He's too holy for you. Does he really look like a holy man now, or does he look like he's got mental problems? It really doesn't sound too nice. But leaving that aside, if there really is a problem that somehow God is 100% holy, so we need to fill a gap with a go-between, a mediator, tell me, how holy is the mediator? 98%? 50%? I imagine that the mediator that most people have in mind is supposed to be 100% holy. We seem to still have the same problem. Another word of caution about trying to investigate things. The scientist, in doing research work, will from time to time in his investigations have in front of him a contradictory result. Some investigation, some experiment has given him a result that contradicts his hypothesis, the direction he's going in. And he may dismiss that. And that's not usually criticized if his dismissal is not a systematic thing. That is, he may say, well, when we ran the test this time, it came out this way, and that would go against my hypothesis, but it could be, maybe there was some dirt in the test tube, or something that messed up the result. He may do it again. He doesn't stop the first time something goes against his hypothesis. You may set that aside and say, well, it's true, that doesn't fit what my idea is, but I'm going to press on because this could be a fluke. This could be explained away maybe by something I haven't thought of. The danger is when such an investigator would systematically set aside the things that contradict him. That is, every time he's presented with a problem, since it doesn't fit my theory, I put it over here. I set it aside. Maybe puts a file called flukes and he puts them in there and he presses on. He's not really making any progress then. It's the systematic setting aside of contrary observations, not just the odd little problem that comes up, but when you develop a scheme by which you set aside all the things that don't agree with you. As some have said, I stress only some, but as some have said, and it's become a popular systematic way of setting things aside, famous quotation is, all theology is paradox. That is, when you're investigating God and you come across something that seems to be self-contradictory, a paradox, rejoice. That's what theology is. Isn't it beautiful? It is absurd, therefore I believe it, as one man said 17 centuries ago. All theology is paradox. That is to say, in every other field of endeavor, when we meet a paradox, we know we made a wrong assumption somewhere. We better start over. But in theology, the more we find, the better we're doing. That's what theology is. Some will say that. That's a systematic setting aside of all the problems that confront one. As one man that I respect very much has said in this century, Alfred North Whitehead. He pointed out that what I suppose many intelligent men have known throughout human history, but he clarified it by saying we come to realize that it is in dealing with the ultimate abstractions that we get the most done in the concrete. That is to say, when we're really making some progress is when we can perform our lab work in our heads, the thought experiment, because work done in the lab can be messed up by some little things that interfere that you don't notice. Lab work is, of course, very valuable, but when you can establish something based on the experiment done here, where everything's under control, then you have really got something concrete. The thought experiment is a legitimate method of research, and it trades on this idea of paradox. I wish I had $1 for every time somebody said to me, God and man can be combined in one person. It's like the wave-particle duality of matter. Is it? Under certain circumstances, matter behaves as though it's waves. Under other circumstances, it behaves as though it's made of particles. But there's no physicist who will tell you, and the amazing thing is, it's both waves and particles. They won't tell you that because of the thought experiment. A person might imagine, well, suppose it's both waves and particles. If I did such and so, he designs an experiment in his mind. If I did this, well then if matter is made of particles, I'll find my particle here. But if it's made of waves, I'll find it there when I'm finished. Well, I can't find it in both places, so at least one of my assumptions is wrong. Either it's particles, or it's waves, or it's neither one, but it can't be both. Because I'd be led to something that cannot be the case. The person doesn't even have to do the experiment. In a similar way, this is what mortality, immortality is. It's two different things. We put the mortals here and the immortals here. They don't have any members in common, but because they are exactly opposite descriptions of a state of affairs. The real message of the Muslim, maybe a lot of Muslims don't appreciate it, to the Christian is not to tell the Christian, you ought to leave what you have and come over here to me, come over on my side. You won't find that as being a methodology in the Quran. The real message that spoke to Jews, Christians, the Magians, Sabaeans, and various other individuals in the Quran was first to tell them, commit no excess. It was to tell them, stand fast by what you know for sure. Leave aside the things that you have no warrant for. In other words, don't insist on what can't be proven. There might even be some claims you make which are true, but if you can't prove them, then don't claim them. You might be right, but don't go insisting on them if you don't have the proof that comes with it. Insist on the things that you have proof for. Everyone agrees you have proof. The Muslim is in agreement. Do not insist on what can't be actually proved. Commit no excess. Which is probably something like what one famous Christian writer had in mind in the first half of this century, when he was saying that he was not toying with the idea of leaving his religion or anything. He wanted to do the right thing. He wanted to be a good Christian. But he said, sometimes, from time to time, it haunts me. I worry. A dream recurs to me, and I'm concerned about it. Expressed recurring fear that he'd push away and it would come back. He said, I imagine that it's the judgment day and I meet Jesus and he says to me, do you worship me? And I will tell him, yes, of course. And he'll say, why? And I will say, because you made the world. And he will say to me, did I tell you that I made the world? Sometimes it worries me. There's a man who studied it very carefully. Couldn't find those words anywhere, so that worried him. That's something the Muslim can be sympathetic toward, saying, well then, if he made the world, that's nice, but since you can't prove it, you shouldn't insist that he did. Leave it. Now, I also start off by saying that people often try to make issues fall into two halves or sometimes into three parts, and that's a thing to be cautious of. It's a trick of argument sometimes, that is the double bind or maybe the triple bind. Beware of it. If I say to this man, answer me, yes or no. Will you stop beating your wife? Yes or no. No explanation. See, you might not even be married. But if I say, yes or no, will you stop beating your wife? I've forced him to take some kind of a position of admitting, well, he must be beating his wife, whatever he answers. In a similar way, we have this infamous trilemma, which is sometimes cited, saying to the Muslims, look, you Muslims have three choices. Either Jesus was telling the truth, or he was a lunatic, or he was lying when he said he was God. But that's where you want to put on the brakes. When did he say that? But people insist to tell me, which of the three choices is it? It remains to be established yet that he said such a thing. Then we might be, if that was established, faced with these three choices. I know if I start quoting from the Bible and all that, that may be somewhat upsetting. The point is often misunderstood, that it is not the Muslim's job to reinterpret the Bible anyway. That's not what he has in mind. You quote chapter and verse and say such and such is the case. It is not to reinterpret it, it's to simply show the existence of interpretation, which again is to reflect a scientific attitude. If a scientist says, look, I've proved such and such, here's my evidence, his colleagues, that's why they have the referee system, will possibly point out to him, well, all of the evidence you bring is compatible with your idea, but look, they could also be compatible with this idea. That is, as long as you are building on interpretation, you haven't really established something. Something like saying, the earth is flat because I've been to the ocean, I've seen the nice straight line the horizon makes. Well, if the earth was flat, it might look like that. In fact, it wouldn't, but you might think that it would look like that and it agrees with your idea and that would convince you the earth is flat. But as it happens, the earth is round and it still looks as it does. You're interpreting the evidence to agree with you. And the Muslim is doing the same thing. If he's talking about Bible verses, he's only trying to point out that as long as there is the possibility of another meaning here, then a person has no right to insist on a particular meaning. At most, in citing something, a person has brought compatible evidence, but a mere possibility cannot be insisted on. And the Quran tells about half the story of religion, I suppose in the 3rd chapter and the 6th verse, when it talks about people who are liable to be misled when they have some hard and fast and locked in place statements and they have some ambiguous statements in front of them. And instead of deciding the ambiguous statements based on the ones that are perfectly clear, they leave aside the clear ones and they trade on the ambiguities. They lean on the ambiguities. So a person could be led to all kinds of ideas. There was a little pamphlet a few years ago where a lawyer, in fact he's a lawyer whose name's in the Guinness Book of Records, the most successful lawyer ever, attempted to show that the Quran proves the divinity of Jesus. And he quotes the Quran, a few verses. Well, he did it by taking these completely out of the context that they're talked about, and then of course he can give them any meaning he likes. If you leave them in the context, you base them on clear statements in other places, the ambiguity is gone. That's what the Muslim would insist or suggest is possibly the difficulty in certain circles where people have read something and given it a meaning. The Quran says, who pledges loyalty to the messenger, is speaking of Muhammad, who pledges loyalty to the messenger, pledges loyalty to God. But no Muslim says, well, that's because the messenger is God. You understand that. You're loyal to God if you're loyal to his messenger because God said, obey this one. But a person might warp that one all by itself. That's that statement, give another meaning. In a similar way, if it's reported that Jesus said, who honors me honors God, I suppose if he was God he would say that. But at the same time, that's also compatible with the idea that God has said, honor this one, and if you honor this one, you honor God. Do what he asks you to do. So it's possible it has a different meaning. What often happens is other statements that seem to be much more clear, statements like Jesus saying there are things that God knows that I don't know, or God is greater than I, they seem to be all clear. Those are sometimes set aside and called difficult sayings of Jesus. They call it difficulties, yes, but maybe the labels are reversed. Maybe these are the clear ones, and the others are the ones that are causing difficulties. And they probably cause less difficulties if we started with these that are so clear. Now I know that there's another argument, which in fact I find very curious as an attitude, where people will say, well, it's true, you could always give another meaning to these verses. In fact, James W. Sire, who wrote a book called Scripture Twisting, wrote me back when I suggested this to him. I kept a copy of the letter, where he said it's true, a person could read the whole Bible and not get the impression Jesus is God. There's always another way to read it. He states on the other end, he says, but I have a different method. He said, I assumed he was before I started reading, and I found all kinds of evidence to support my idea, which is not really an honest way to judge something. We don't go to court that way. Verdict first, then the evidence. We're supposed to do it the other way around. But some argumentation is sometimes offered to say, yes, you might find another meaning for all these words, but look, the Jews were there at the time and they understood him. What's interesting about that is the same person who will tell you that is likely to tell you on another occasion, if you ask him, why did the disciples see that Jesus was divine? And they'll tell you they had trouble with that until it was finally revealed to them. They seem to be saying his enemies understood him. It was his friends that couldn't figure him out. And did, in fact, the Jews understand him? It's reported that he complained they didn't, Mark chapter 4. So evidently there were different opinions about who he was. Which opinion did he endorse? What's frequently cited is John chapter 10. Jesus says something, the Jews pick up stones to throw at him. He says to them, what do you want to stone me for? They say, you, although you are a man, claim equality with God. Verse 32, period. There's 10 more verses in that chapter. What did Jesus say in the next verse? Say, well, you heard me right. It's too bad you don't like it, but I'm equal to God. Take that. What he did in the next 10 verses was to go back over what he said very carefully, to quote Scripture to them, to say, in effect, not so fast. Look, doesn't it say in your book, such and such and so and so? And didn't I say such and such and so? Now, what have I said that's blasphemous? That's the whole point of that chapter. Point out to them, not that they heard him right, but to go back and say, how can you make an accusation like that? In fact, he did it by quoting something to say that his statement was much less of a dramatic pronouncement than that made of other people. Why quote the Bible in the first place? Well, to start with, the Muslim quotes the Bible. It's not really much of an argument to say if he quotes it, he should accept it. I imagine the most zealous of evangelical missionaries will quote the Quran. I wouldn't suggest that must mean if you're going to quote it, you have to accept it. Let's realize this is a two-way street. But to quote it, the Muslim is really imitating what seems to be the methodology of Jesus. I suggest you try it as an experiment sometime. Ask somebody who may be very involved in Bible reading. Ask him sometime, but use these words. Say, why do you search the Scriptures? Those words, not some other words. Why do you search the Scriptures? And I can almost guarantee you, he will tell you, because in them is the key to eternal life. Look here, and he'll quote to you from John chapter 5, where Jesus said to the Jews, you search the Scriptures because you believe that in there is the key to eternal life. Well, then he hadn't really understood what Jesus said, has he? Did Jesus say, in there is the key to eternal life? He was talking to a group of Jews who read the Scriptures all the time, and he told them why they did it. You search the Scriptures because in there you think is the key to eternal life. He didn't say whether they're right or wrong. They may be right, may be wrong, but he didn't endorse that to say that's what's in there. What he went on to say was that if they were reading it carefully enough, they'd be listening to him, because those things they're reading talked about him. That was his whole point. And in a similar way, that's what the Quran says about the writings possessed by Jews and Christians and other people. It says, if they will look in their writings, they will find this last message and messenger mentioned. It's leaving aside the idea whether or not these writings are true or false. That's another subject. But when stating that, it's saying true or false, they do contain this information. And so it is in this statement of Jesus in John chapter 5. If he really said such a thing, that's the most it means. Telling these people, you take it so seriously, take it seriously. Look carefully. In there you'll find it tells you about me. So whether it's true or false is beside the point. It's directing you to me. And if you believe it, you should be directed toward me. This too comes near a point of confusion, I'm afraid. The Quran discusses Christian writings, but it does not mention the Bible. It talks about the people of the book, it talks about Jews and Christians, although it uses more accurate terms than that. It's another story, but it does not talk about the Bible. So it is that sometimes Muslims are led into some confusion where somebody says, look, your book says my book is right, because my book is this one, the Bible. Bible is a nickname. It means library. It's a nickname for a collection of books. It's not even the word used in many languages. The word isn't in that book anywhere. It's a nickname for a collection, which is said to contain the same thing that the Quran is talking about. Well, maybe it does, maybe not, but the contents are not itemized in the Quran. The Quran talks about these people and what they have as writings, saying that in those writings there is truth which they know about, truth which they know about and they hide, and truth which they have passed over, they didn't notice. Possess some writings which contain truth that they know about, truth that they know about but don't tell anyone, and some truth that they have passed over, they've missed. It does not say the whole thing's true, because it also says, fourthly, they have some other material which they have given the status of God's Word, and it doesn't deserve that status. And that's not some kind of a Muslim idea. It's not an attack on the Bible. It's an attack on opinions held by some. When Martin Luther published a Bible hundreds of years ago, he took James, Hebrews, and Revelation and put them in the back as an appendix, because he said this is not Revelation. It doesn't really solve the problem to say, well, Luther was wrong. It's just showing that sincere people within the community still understand till now that when you say Bible, you're talking about a collection and exactly what ought to be in there and what may be valuable but doesn't belong in there with the status of divinely revealed words. It's something that's still open to discussion or investigation. In fact, he said of the four Gospels that they were not equally valuable. He said, ironically enough, he said the book of Revelation reveals nothing. Now, perhaps the origin of some of the difficulties in reconciling differences in Christianity and Islam between Christians and Muslims is made apparent in a certain attitude that has grown out of the sources. And this is what I'm talking about. It is frequently cited. Various texts are used, but most commonly some writing of Paul's where he says, after explaining how the scheme works, he says, if this isn't true, then we are to be pitied. Well, that's a tactic of argument sometimes called slippery slope. That is, when you haven't quite convinced your audience, you point out to them how awful it would be if it wasn't true what you said. Still doesn't prove that it's true, that's just a scare tactic. say, if this isn't true, then we're a bunch of fools, or whatever. That tends to develop a certain kind of an attitude that holds one back from considering the alternatives, because you've been told that, no, there is no alternative. The alternatives to this are disaster. Compare that to the attitude which is expressed in the Quran in an interesting verse which says, the Muslim recites it, in fact, it's given, as many verses are, with the command, Qul, say. That is, don't just read this, you're supposed to say it. It reads, say, if God has a son, I will be the first to worship him. That's the Muslim attitude. He's not told, anybody tells you God has a son, look out, this is trouble, this is danger, this is disaster. In fact, it tells you, if someone can show you he really does, then you shouldn't wait for someone to go ahead of you in line. You'll be the first to worship him if they can show you this is literally true. If somewhere there is a son who's a son in a different way than everybody else is a son. Seems like a healthier attitude to have. I'm not saying all Muslims have that attitude. I'm not saying all Christians have the other attitude. But that may account for some of the difficulties of reconciliation. If you've been frightened on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Muslim is supposed to be encouraged to continue to investigate this matter. The outgrowth of that kind of attitude can be seen. I'm not picking on Martin Luther. Perhaps if he were around, he might change his mind about some things as well. But it was Luther who said something which has taken root in the hearts of a lot of people, maybe even if they haven't heard his exact words or expression of it. There was a man who explained that he was very frustrated by his desire to do good, but he kept doing bad. The more he wanted to do good, the worse it seemed to get. And he developed a novel outlook on things when he said, sin is not when I do these bad things. Sin is unfaith. That is, sin is when I stop believing. Then of course I will do bad things. My sin is that I didn't believe. Sin is unfaith. Sometimes I've seen lists of sins and people put lust, envy, greed, doubt. Doubt? The sin, the doubt. Doubt is a mechanism in the mind that's supposed to alert you something might be wrong here. Stop at this point, re-examine it, or don't forget, you still have to come back and clear this up. Doubt is a healthy thing that goes on in your mind so that you are making sure of your progress as you go along. You can disconnect it, but you can also take the batteries out of your smoke alarm. It won't make that terrible noise anymore. Yes, and you may choke to death in a fire. If you disconnect this circuitry that sounds when something might be wrong, you may be led to some erroneous results. You can snip one or two wires off the back of a computer, and it will still do a lot of nice things for you, but every so often it'll do something very silly because you've tampered with the circuitry. So it is, you tamper with this faculty that annoys you when something doesn't quite ring true. It tells you, stop, go over this again, be careful. It's not telling you something is wrong, it's telling you you haven't got it clear in your own mind yet. As I may have touched on much too quickly last night, the point is that a person may make mistakes and he has penalties to pay. But a person commits crimes and he has a punishment for a crime. Because mistakes and crimes are different things. A mistake is done in ignorance. A crime is when you know this is wrong, but you do it anyway. For that you have punishment. You pay penalties for your errors. You get into trouble because of your mistakes. But you receive punishment for your crime. So it is that belief cannot be a crime. What you believe can't be a crime, a thing you're guilty of. What you know is part of what you believe. If you know something is true, it's part of what you believe. So how can belief be a crime? A crime is when you know better, but you do another thing. How could a person say, I know this is true, but I believe that it's false? It doesn't make any sense at all. What you know is part of what you believe. A person can't be punished for his belief. He may be punished for how it is he came to that stage. That is, the Quran mentions that one crime that a man is guilty of, it mentions that he heard somebody say something, it says he got up and he left. And he failed to saddaqah, and virtually every English translation I've seen of the Quran mistranslates that word there. It says he failed to give alms and charity. They got the wrong form of the verb. In this place it's the double dal in the middle, and it means he didn't check on it. He didn't make sure it was true. He heard it, and he just didn't worry about it. Might be true, might not be. Just rattled around in his head. That's a crime. You're supposed to process the information you have and sort out the garbage from what is worthwhile. Doesn't mean we don't make mistakes as we go along and do them, but we're supposed to be involved in doing that kind of thing. So those are a few thoughts till now. I hope actually what I've done is outline maybe the difficulties that can stand in the way of profitable discussion, rather than, as I say, offering you some kind of an alternate explanation of things and hoping to attract you to the beautiful sound of this explanation compared to that explanation. We don't really make any progress until we open the door. It is pointed out to people that there may be some obstacles that need recognizing before we can make the progress. And in any discussion where we hope to arrive at some conclusions, we really have to start by deciding how is it we'll recognize the truth when we find it anyway. We should set up some rules ahead of time. I suggest that maybe some of those rules might be that whether a thing is true or false, we aren't going to insist on it unless we can document that this is the case. We don't discuss plausibilities and insist on them. We talk about other things that can be settled, that can be calculated. We might adopt as a rule that if two things are precisely opposite, well then we can have one or the other or neither, but we can't have them both. So we want to carefully watch out for falling into this kind of thing. Now it's true that this can be done maybe in widely separated occasions. What I often suggest is that to the Muslim, if you're asking somebody a question and you're not satisfied with his answer, press on until he gives you his best answer. It may be a perfectly good answer. I mean, just because he's not on your side, his answer isn't right. But when he gets to his best answer, make a note of it, that this was the answer to that question. On another occasion, what you will often find is that when you ask some other question and you press on for the best answer, that the man may also give you finally a good answer, but that answer is incompatible with the answer to another question. That is, if you put them side by side, you may be in a position of having a couple of good answers, but he can't have them both. He can have one or the other. Or maybe he needs to throw them both out, but he can't have them both. And you start to see those things which are mutually exclusive, that you can start to set aside some alternatives and find a small list of things that you can agree on. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, and we'll be happy to consider some of your questions. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Gary. I would like now to open the floor for question and answer. If you have any question, please, you're most welcome to ask it and entertain it. Go ahead.
Mr. Miller, what I understand from my little knowledge of Bible is that during the end of Jesus, may peace be upon him, when the Jews came to him and said, show us a miracle, and Jesus in reply said to them, only the adulterous generation asks for miracles. So no miracle will be shown to you except the miracle of prophet Jonah may peace be upon him. As Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so shall be the Son of Man will be in the belly of the whale, in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. By the Son of Man, I think prophet Jesus may peace be upon him said to himself that he was the Son of Man. But when we look into the Bible, at least I find at least one thing which doesn't complement the saying. Like the Christians, they celebrate Good Friday. But if you take the days and nights, it adds up to be 2 nights and 1 day. And other dissimilarities are over there. So will you please kindly explain that phenomena?
Okay, maybe touch on a number of things. Maybe the easiest one first. That it's true that some people have suggested that if he said 3 days, no matter how I count it, I can't get 3 days and 3 nights out of it. Someone say, well, you count every piece of a day as a whole day. You still can't do it. You get a piece of Friday and a night, and a piece of Saturday and a night, and a piece of Sunday. You can't squeeze 3 nights out of it. So it is that that doesn't really worry me too much. That seems to be that, well, somebody's got their dates wrong. That's all. Which is what you'll find if you compare the first 3 Gospels with the last Gospel, when it talks about the whole event anyway. I forget which group is which. You have to look it up for yourself. But the 3 tell one date and the other tells another date. That is, one group says that this Last Supper that he had with his disciples was before the Passover, and the other one says it's after. It moves the thing. So it is that there have been some who have suggested that what must have happened was the whole thing started on a Wednesday, not on a Friday. Fine, whatever explanation they have, that's terrific. There are those who are willing to indicate that something is maybe strange in the actual recording of the events. That's not really a big problem for the Muslim. In other words, if it's true that Jesus said he would be 3 days, 3 nights, the Muslim believes he was. Never mind that some of the people who wrote about it seem to have got something turned around. So if he really said it, the Muslim was confident that's what happened. On the other hand, maybe he didn't really say it. But the point that's more important there is that it is sometimes said, it came up last night, that Jesus did things that only God could do, and in that way he proved his divinity. But really, which things were these? You can open up the 2 Kings chapters 3, 4, and 5. You'll find, usually on 2 pages, you can read about Elisha healing a leper and a blind man, raising a boy from the dead, and multiplying some food. See, so virtually anything Jesus did, somebody else did without being divine. The one exception that's often pointed to is to say what he did that nobody else did was he was dead for 3 days and got up again. But if you stick strictly to what was said there, he said the sign he's going to give is the sign of Jonah, who was not dead for 3 days, just as Jonah was in. It's an exact parallel of the sign. The sign of Jonah was he's swallowed by a big animal. What we expect is he dies. The miracle is he lived. For 3 days he was alive instead of dead. So it would seem to be, if you have a man and you execute him and you put him in the ground, if he's dead, there's no miracle. But if you think you've executed him, you put him in the ground and he's in there alive for 3 days, this looks like a miracle, just like the sign of Jonah. So that, again, I suggest even in that case, you have an exact parallel. And that's not some kind of a new Muslim idea. J.N.D. Kelly's book, Early Christian Doctrine, which is studied by virtually anybody who studies for the ministry, will tell you that the idea that Jesus was not crucified, as he puts it, was a common heresy even in the first century. Heresy means it's a lie told by people within the Christian community. Heresy is his opinion of it. The fact remains, as he's saying, is that there were those even in the first century who said they were Christian, but Jesus was not crucified, but he was not dead. So this is not such a hard and fast and settled thing as somebody might like to say that it is. And I'm not saying what happened is what happened to Jonah, but that's a possible explanation that's in agreement with the words that are reported to have been said by him. I hope that covers everything you want to go into. That's a lecture in itself, I suppose, that very subject.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Yes?
Mr. Miller, in my loudmouth, reference to one of your newspaper articles regarding concise response or answer to Christianity.
Yeah, because at first I didn't have anything to do with putting them in the paper, and I haven't read them, so I don't know exactly what might have been in what day or which day and what
All
you're
right,
talking
well,
about.
this is concerning ambiguous evidence,
Yes.
specifically in John 8:58.
Yeah.
Okay, it is questioned in this article whether Jesus made or assumed in his statement a divine title. And it is asserted that the words in John 8:58 translated I am do not coincide with the words in Exodus 3:14 in the Greek. There's a copy of the Septuagint in Watson Library. And the phrase in question reads, ego eimi hoon. Ego is a personal pronoun translated I. Eimi is a verb and the principal word in the phrase, translated I am. Ho is the Greek article, translated the. And on is neither a noun nor a verb, but it is a participle, and it stands in relation to eimi as an adverb. It can be translated with the article as the one who is, and the entire phrase would be I am, or we would say the emphatic form. You could translate it even I am the one who is. My question to you can be answered in one word. What is the root verb from which the participle on is derived?
We're talking about his being. It's usually translated as being, and I don't know what the infinitive form is in the Greek.
Is the root
On is the root above it, whatever is the infinitive, which means be.
Okay, the root verb is eimi. And so not only in that verse, in John and in Exodus, are the words I am translated from ego eimi, but also the words that you cited in your article are also derived from the same.
Oh, right. Okay, fine. I see the point. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Okay. Now, what I would suggest is that I don't know particularly which thing you're looking at, but there is it Steve Johnson here next week?
He's going to be October the 26th of this month.
Yeah, I'm not trying to just put the burden on him, but recently in having a discussion with a man who's supposed to be here next month, he was showing me he had collected the evidence for how you do not have ego eimi, ho, that is, the things are missing, but it has been added in Greek editions of the Bible. That is, the quotation has been made exact by modern day editions of the Greek. But the thing does not follow the parallel. In other words, even as you said, it may say ego eimi ho on here, and it says ego eimi here. The quotation is not the same. The title that's applied is ho on, and that's not what Jesus said. And what was the reaction to the people who heard him anyway? What he talked about, I've been here before Abraham, and so on. Didn't the Jews say, you're not even 50 years old? It seems what they seem to have understood by that was not a claim of divinity, but it sounded like he's saying he's very old. He's not quoting a title. If it all happened this way in the first place. In fact, I suggest that that's a worthwhile investigation you've done, but you ought to take it up with the people who care most about this very verse. You have, which a friend of mine is studying Koine Greek in Toronto. There is an evangelical publishing house which has printed an interlinear Bible, and from the New Testament where it quotes the Old. suggests that while they may, the same group may be telling parishioners, Jesus quoted that, when it comes down to actually putting something in print, they back off from that because it isn't a quote. They don't cite it as a paraphrase or anything. This is not among the list of quotations. So the words may start out the same, but you haven't really got a quote. That might have been rounded out by a modern day Greek translation where somebody will put in John 8:58, ego eimi ho on, something like the way the Living Bible tosses something in. So I admire your research, but take it up with the people who would really like to make the most use of it. Go and ask the Evangelical Publishing House, why can't you see this point? Why did you not call this a quote? Because they didn't, and they probably would like to, but they have their reasons. So I admire that you go to that link. Take it up with Steve next month too, to see what he'll tell you about it.
Steve is a Jesuit priest who converted to Islam, so I think he has 2 PhDs and 2 masters and 2 bachelors, so he's an encyclopedia, I guess.
I'll try to remember you had your hand.
Well, I have a question regarding the translation of Quran, which has been several attempts to write in English. And I would like you to tell me, the audience, which one do you prefer, and which one do you use disregard? Because I know of one that used to be a text was here, it looks like everything got Quran.
Well, I may have my personal preferences, but they're still only a translation anyway. Arbery is very smooth reading, and I had seen the manuscript, but it's not yet in book form, of Irving's. He spent 25 years translating. He spent 1 year on one word, as it happened. So I suppose I might recommend those, but what I usually tell people is, if you want to find out something about what the Quran says, get as many translations as you can. There's probably a dozen, but get them all. And as you're reading, compare them. Now, if you've got 10 translations and they all put the same thought in the same verse, well, then you're probably pretty close to the meaning. But if they seem to disagree with one another, then you should realize that somebody has a problem here, and then go and ask somebody who might be able to tell you more. It was my experience that the first translation I ever read was one of the words. The one David, with it's all shuffled around in a different order. And when I then met some Muslims, we'd get into conversations and they'd say, well, you know, the Quran says such and such and so. And I was very frustrated. I read the whole thing, I didn't see that. Show me the verse. I look in the translation, the point is totally lost, passed over. That was a first clue that if you want to catch what's in there, you've got to at least gather around you some people you can trust that are going to be pointing out to you that somebody has smoothed over a meaning or they've lost the thought here. And in fact, you'll never get a good translation because the two languages are very different kinds of languages. Arabic is, say, morphological. That is, every word starts from a root, and according to certain things you do to the word, you develop a whole family. So that if the Arab says kitab and he means book, he carries a whole flavor of what is writing and where do you do it and where do you find books and all of this. It's all wrapped up in this word that you can't quite do in English. We may use book, desk, office, all come from different roots, but they come from the same root in the Arabic. Okay, yes.
Mine's kind of the same question. Do you know Arabic? Can you read Arabic?
Read it, yeah.
Yeah, you do. Do you understand can you read the Quran in Arabic?
Sure, with a dictionary in the other hand.
Okay. Because I've read the Quran in an English translation. I can't even attempt to read it in Arabic. My question is, do you understand it when you read it in Arabic?
Yeah, as I said, if I've got a dictionary in the other hand, as I go on, what I usually do is take very short pieces at a time, like maybe 10 verses or something, and go over it like an exercise in translation, make sure I've got every word.
Okay. Because I know that they have some books that explain the Quran. Is this true?
Yes.
For some people, they read the Quran, they don't understand it because
Well,
the Arabic is old and they
Yes,
don't.
but that's, sometimes you'll find that people have some funny ideas about that. That is, there are people who will tell you that no one can understand the Quran except
Yeah.
for a few people and read what they said. I have no use for people like that. They are in effect saying God cannot communicate with man very easily. He needs people to explain him better. As though there's somebody who says, well, what God is trying to tell you here, I understand, but you can't. And then they interpret it. That, I think, is an insult. That does not mean that everybody can just open up the Quran and the whole meaning comes to it. But what has unfortunately happened in many cases is that people confuse teacher with interpreter. A teacher is a person who makes things clear to you because he shows you the facts. He says, well, now you know this, you put that together, and he encourages you now, what do you think that is? He uses his experience to guide you along. An interpreter is a person who is saying, you won't understand what's being said here, so I will tell you. And that, there's no such thing in Islam. It's not supposed to be. Those commentaries you talk about are usually called tafsir, and the only time that word is found in the Quran, it's in that sense of explanation, not interpretation. Yeah, that is to say, if there's something you don't understand, by all means ask. But when you meet somebody who says, I know about this because of some secret ability I have,
No,
go
it's
ask
not.
somebody else.
No, it's not the secret of it. Because for some people, it's very difficult to understand what is written in the Quran. This is correct. For some Muslims,
I suppose, but that...
it's explained to them by a teacher or a imam or...
Yes, but it is supposed to be, as I said, explained, not interpreted.
Okay.
That is, if a man makes a mistake, that what he says has to stand on its own merits, not because of what kind of hat does he wear, or something like this. They're supposed to defend what it is they tell you about. Unfortunately, that's not always done. Yes.
Yeah, I would like to ask you a question about the salvation. Christians maintain that Jesus died for the sins of the world, and to inherit the kingdom of God, you have to believe in salvation. I would like you to tell me, how do the Christians regard the faith of the people who came before Jesus Christ? Obviously, the people who came before him didn't know him.
Yeah.
So, how do the Christians regard the faith of those, and in particular, this might be a difficult question, the faith of the Jews?
Well, they have different schools of thought. They give you at least 3 different answers. So, see, where you started was to say you must believe in this thing in order to gain salvation has been challenged by some within the church. That is, they say, well, if I'm guilty because my ancestor sinned, whether I believe it or not, I should be saved because of the actions of one man, whether I believe it or not. That is, why should it be that I'm guilty, whether I believe it or not? But in order to be saved, I've got to believe it. It doesn't seem to be balanced. This was the universalist tradition where they'd cite, well, what it says here is through one man sin entered the world, and Jesus died for the sins of all. So some would see it that way. Others will tell you that it was not really a case of he pays the price for our sins so much as it was a demonstration of God's justice, how seriously God takes sin, is the crucifixion. Which sounds good to start with, usually when people say that. It's not like some price had to be paid and God can't forgive, but God did have to demonstrate his justice. But the problem is that if you tell a person, look, I believe God is just, I don't need a demonstration, I believe it, I believe he's just, they'll tell you, but unless you believe that this demonstration happened, all is lost. So it may be called a demonstration by some, the same group by and large tends to still insist, but you must believe in this thing or all is lost. It still takes on the connotation of a payment. As to what happens to the people before or after, you might say, what about a North American Indian? He lived 1,000 years ago. Didn't have a chance to ever hear about Jesus. Jesus has come and gone. This man was born, lived, and died. Never heard of him. What about him? Is Is he saved or lost or what happened? You get three answers. Some will tell you he's lost, too bad. Well, it doesn't sound very just. That is, a man is being punished for his ignorance, and this for something he had no control over. Doesn't seem just. Others will say, no, he was ignorant. He cannot be punished. He will be rewarded. That doesn't seem fair either. God should have left us all ignorant. I wish he hadn't told me, if that's the case, you see. Or the third option, which is pointed to, I believe it's the first chapter of the book of Romans, for the support of it, where Paul is saying that even among the nations, that is, among the people who don't know anything about this, they know the difference between right and wrong, and they'll answer for what it is they know. So they'll offer that as the third alternative. To say, well, they didn't know this, but they do know certain things, and they will answer to it. A man knows some things are good, some are bad, and if he chooses the bad in spite of that, he'll answer that because he knew better. And that's very interesting because that's the Muslim position. You answer for what it is you know. It's not which club you joined or something like this. I suppose it's a recurring theme throughout the Quran. It's simply that what you do matters. There's some neutral acts, but there are some others that must be good or must be bad, and you answer for both kinds. Okay? Yes?
Please, I would like to know from your own experience, what are the points that made you convert to Islam from your own experience as a previous Christian?
Well, it's not that exciting of a story. It isn't because some Muslim said A, B, C, and said, oh my God. I didn't know any Muslims. It's just a matter of, for about 15 years I was in the habit of looking into the difference between what was in the Bible and what the church was likely to say. And as I moved from city to city, I used to call on the priests and ministers and ask them, why is it you say this but your book says that? That for years. It was a healthy kind of exercise that I enjoyed. And it occurred to me one day to have a look at the Quran, see what's in there that made any sense. And 3 or 4 days later, I finished reading. It's not that big, and realized, well, this is what I've been saying for 15 years. This is a condensed version of the thing that I've always tried to insist on. So then I went to find some Muslims. As to the authenticity of the book, that is somewhat involved in what I just touched on last night, so-called proof by exhaustion. That is, you draw up a list of possible explanations, establish that there's no other explanation, then you eliminate them all, and, except for one, and you're left with that one, which is more or less what a lot of people have done, that they're not Muslim, but they have eliminated all the other explanations, and they will at least give you that, well, it is what it says it is. I just happened to notice that before we started tonight, I pulled a man's card out of my pocket there. Keith Moore is his name, Associate Dean, Basic Sciences, University of Toronto. He's the author of a number of textbooks on embryology. And when he was asked, this is non-Muslim, still is, but when he was asked to investigate what does the Quran say about embryology, his conclusion was, this is a revelation. How this information came to be in there. Didn't mean he embraced Islam, but he eliminated other alternatives, and I said this much. Yeah.
Some Christians claim that Islam is similar to Christianity in Trinity. They said that Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is equal to Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. What's your response for them?
Well, let's start with those. Ar-Rahman and Rahim are attributes, and as the Quran says, you call on Allah by this name or any other names. The Quran has more than 100 attributes of Allah. Sometimes you see them grouped as 99. That's just a traditional list. There are attributes in the Quran that are not on that list of 99. So if saying Allah Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim means he's 3, you've got to wrap these others up and say, well, you know, he's 102 or something like this. If that's all it takes is to use a name, which is the same kind of argument, as I hope you see, has not really worked very much as an argument, because the statement of this distinction and yet unity isn't included in there. Some people will say, look, the Trinity is proved in Matthew chapter 28. Jesus said, go baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. He named 3 items. He also named in another sentence Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What does that mean? The 3 are somehow one and yet distinct, or whatever. It's 3 items in one sentence, that's all. It doesn't say, we'll baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, the co-eternal, consubstantial, etc. All of the explanation that's required for this. So, I'm familiar with that kind of thing. People say that sometimes, but really it's not. It's kind of an unworthy statement to make, isn't it? So you said this, so you must mean this, and put something in your mouth. Okay, does that mean we covered everything? Oh, it's on the...
I've got several questions, but I'm just waiting for my turn. When I look into Bible, I don't find that Jesus said to himself or said himself to somebody that I am God or worship me. You cannot find any such statement which says explicitly and not is ambiguous. And when I talk to my friends who believe in the religion preached by Jesus, may peace be upon him, they say that he said, I and Father are one. Or you have answered that question already. That they say that I was there before Abraham. So how do you?
Those are 2 different places.
Yeah, 2 different. They give me this answer, which verifies that he was God.
Well,
how do you?
That place is. Father and I are one, is John 10 and 30, and that's the chapter I was talking about where the Jews thought he was claiming equality with God at that point. And he went on to tell them, not so fast. The statement is not blasphemous. If the person would insist that somehow he was still trying to sneak across the meaning in there, it's still a long ways from establishing that. If I said to you, my Father and I are one, you're going to ask me, one what? So, you want to read on. He makes similar statements in other places. The 17th chapter of John, he says, Father and I are one, and all of our disciples are one with us. I and them, they, me, I and he, and so on. Whatever's meant by this one, it's something other than some unity of Godhead or nature or something. I'd say, too, if you put that in context, it seems to me, if the whole report is accurate anyway, put it in context, he seems to be trying to put a stop to something the Jews are accusing him of. As you read up to that, they are accusing him of equivocating and saying, when would you tell us? Are you this? Are you that? And so on. And what leads up to that point is where he's trying to make a very blunt statement about intention and purposes and so on. But I leave that to somebody to read the whole thing. But you mentioned worship, and I know that's sometimes talked about, where someone will say, look here, a man came to Jesus and he worshipped him, and Jesus didn't say, no, wait, don't do that. Well, what's interesting is, of course, that word worship had a different flavor back in King James's time, 350 years ago. We still use it in Canada. The mayor of the city is called your worship. It just means you are worthy, ship. You who are worthy of something. Worship then, and now in some places, doesn't have the connotation of worship as something you give to God only, but it's taken on that flavor today, so that whereas you will find in the King James Bible, chapter 2 of Daniel, it says Nebuchadnezzar worshipped Daniel. Daniel, if he understood that this king is giving me something that belongs to God, should have told him to stop, but he didn't. So it sounds more like a salute of some kind. But what you'll find has happened is that in modern translations, many of them of the Bible, in the place where it says Nebuchadnezzar worshipped Daniel, they will put Nebuchadnezzar saluted Daniel. But in the place where it says the man worshipped Jesus, they leave it worship, because it does this job. If you really look into it and find out what is the word there in the Greek, it means he kissed his hand, or he blew him a kiss. It means literally, he kissed the hand toward it. So he may have done this, or he may have taken his fingers and kissed them, and that has been translated worship, which people have kissed my hand. I don't like it at all, but I never thought they were giving me something that belonged to God. Yeah. Any example or what?
Well, because I know that the Muslims follow hadith.
Okay. Well, okay, but you're asking.
And I want to know if the Quran makes any reference to the hadith.
Well, okay, you open a subject that tempers may flare. Because it is.
I'm asking
it
you.
It is largely misunderstood. That is, that when a person says they follow hadith, they should be very cautious. Just careful now. The Quran calls itself hadith and says there's no other.
Yeah.
So that a person, when he says hadith, then he would usually explain it saying, well, okay, but hadith is a loose explanation which refers to these narrations and so on. Okay, fine. So we have to be more precise about terminology. And so it goes. What I'm afraid often happens is that the misunderstanding has been that some Muslims feel that hadith has preserved Islam, when it's supposed to have been the other way around, that it was Muslims who saved hadith. It was Muslims who wanted to make sure that they weren't getting off the track, that they checked into their sources and gathered the evidence that they hadn't got off the track. It was not as though the Quran came and here came a book of hadith too, and we consult this and we consult that. Muslims were following well-observed and established practices. If you pray 5 times a day as a community, how can somebody come along one day and say, we're doing it all wrong? People will say, look, we've been doing it this way, I learned it from my father, and so on. So to challenge that kind of thing, people collected the documentation and said, no, we do it like this, and so on. Unfortunately, what came of that in some circles is that people tended to, instead of treating it as a documentation of what is established, to take it and use it to put burdens on people that people don't need to have. That is where someone may insist. The silliest example that I've ever come across was a man we knew in Toronto who said that he read a hadith. It said Prophet used to eat pumpkin. He said, I ate some and it made me sick. I threw it up. He said, but I kept trying for a year. He says, now I can eat a pumpkin. It stays down. He says, thank God, I'm just like the Prophet. Well, he's completely misunderstanding what's going on. That was never intended as a command or something. And people have, unfortunately, heaped some large burdens on themselves in that regard. They think this must be done, they find out, but even if that's authentic, it's a matter of something a man was doing, not what he said, do this. The same sources that they're citing refer to cases where the story one time, somebody knows better than I suppose, where somebody was giving him a meal and they put a lizard in front of him and said he didn't want to eat it. One of his companions said, is it forbidden? He said, no, where I come from we don't eat these. And the man said, do you mind if I eat it, or something like that? He said, help yourself. See, so not every move he ever made was intended as some kind of a hard and fast command on people, but it's often interpreted that way. And if I say a whole lot more, I'll just get somebody upset. But I hope you see that is not, that is a widely misunderstood situation that a lot of people are in.
So, in the Quran, does it make any reference to the hadith?
What it says,
Because I didn't...
No, it doesn't say what it doesn't say. And when you're finished with this book, go and read that book. But it does tell you that whatever you do, you're supposed to check on it. So that, in fact, if somebody teaches you how to make the prayer, it's recommended that you ought to make sure this man told you right, and investigate the sources in that. But it's not, in effect, saying some things are missing in this book, but you'll find the rest in that book. You find what you need to know in the whole world. You may find it in a telescope or in the public library or whatever, but you're supposed to look. It doesn't say, here's number 1 quality book, here's number 2 quality, and then this not doesn't do that. Look and check. Truth stands on its own merits, not which book you find it in.
So what about the verse from whatever the Prophet gave you, take it?
Well, this too, I know there's a verse that's often quoted. It seems to be, whatever the Prophet gave you, take it, and so on. People who quote that verse can't usually tell you where that verse is. If they look, they'll find out they're quoting a piece of it. The context of the verse is talking about dividing the spoils of war. Again, it's not a statement of saying everything you ever, if you follow the man around you saw him do it. It's something he gave you, take it. And what he gave you, the Quran says, is his usra, his example. And that requires some thought. If you tell a child, follow the example of your older brother, what will that child usually understand? Does he mean, well, my brother parts his hair on the left, I'm going to move mine over, and my brother wears black shoes instead of brown, so I will do that. More likely the parents have in mind, look at the behavior of your brother. He studies when he should, and he doesn't play too hard, and he cleans up his plate, and something to do with his behavior, not his personal preferences or habits that don't seem to be having any particular meaning, or that is, they bring you a certain success as measured against something else.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you for attending this lecture tonight. I would like to draw your attention to one important advertisement. We're going to have some videotapes ready for anybody who want to see them. We have a videotape for Yusuf Baikas called Is the Bible the Word of God? It's a lecture and it's also a debate. The lecture was given in South Africa and is available on a videotape for whosoever wants to see it, and it's free of charge. All what you got to do is to ask for it, and then you bring it back when you are done with it. Also, we have it on debate. The debate was shown also in South Africa. 17,000 people attended the debate, and this was a remarkable one. So if you want to see it also, it's available at our center, and you are most welcome to see it. We have some other lectures done by a famous Muslim scholar whose name is Ahmad Didat also. We have a lecture called Is Jesus God? We have a lecture titled Christ in Islam. We have a lecture also titled Muhammad, the natural successor to Jesus. We have a lecture by Gary Miller and Ahmad Didat called Christianity and Islam. And we have so many more. So if you are willing to see any of them, you must welcome to ask for it. We'll be glad to give it to you free of charge. Thank you very much.